Hey there, thanks for tuning in. Got a quick tutorial on how to use rabbit fur in a dubbing loop. Something you may not be familiar with, but it is a rather effective fly tying technique that you can use the effects of rabbit fur without having the extra bulk of all the leather in the rabbit fur. Quick, easy tutorial. Also another great technique for using leftover materials like, let's say marabou and other materials on stems and on leather. Hopefully you enjoy it. Thanks for watching. Alright, just going to do a quick little demonstration on one way to tie in some rabbit fur into a dubbing loop without the aid of any kind of tool to hold this fur in place. And here I've got a normal rabbit strip. A couple things to consider about your rabbit strip. First thing I like to consider is how thick that leather is. Another thing to consider is how long that fur is, and then how far you want to go along your fly. So whether you're tying it in on the shank or through the eyes, making a nice head, or finishing it off at the end of a fly, you really want to think about how much of this length of leather do I need, and with that length, how much fur will be within that length, and then will that be enough to cover my entire hook? For this particular fly, I'm going to try to cover most of the hook shank here. Of course, I'm going to leave some room for a head. So roughly, I'd say it's about 3/4 of an inch to an inch of hook that I want to cover. So for starters, I'm just going to double the length. Double the length of my hook shank with this rabbit fur. So let's just say there's one hook shank worth, and we'll mark that off with our fingers. And so right now it looks like we've got about 1.5 inches or so of leather that we're gonna cut off to try to cover the entire length. And now if this rabbit fur that's in this loop was a lot thicker, or in reality if the leather itself was thicker, I probably would go a little bit shorter on this just because I know I can get a lot more out of that fur. So since I've got my approximate length of rabbit that I'm going to use, I'm just going to trim that. And we'll give that a nice little trim, and that'll be what we'll be working with. I'm going to set that aside for now. Next we're grabbing our dubbing tool. I like to use the OPST dubbing spinner. To make this loop, we're going to pull out a length of thread, place our left index finger on this thread, come up over the top, right back into that point where we finished our tie off or tie in. A couple wraps around the shank of the hook, and then I'm actually going to wrap around this dubbing loop twice, and then I'm going to spiral my thread forward until I get to the point where I want to finish this fly. And for this fly I'm going to finish, let's say right about there. So I'll let my bobbin hang. I'm keeping this loop open with my index finger. I'm going to take my dubbing spinner and hook it on, and instead of just letting that dangle and basically that dubbing spinner is going to spin on you, it'll just want to spin and get twisted, I like to place my one part of my loop, the left side of my loop, in where the material, usually there's a little spring here or a coil that'll hold your materials. I like to just take this open loop and place one of the sides of thread on that side. So your loop stays open. Now we've got our rabbit fur that we want to get into this loop, and let's just say for sake of argument, I want to use the entire length of that rabbit fur, the actual fur part. I want to use all of that in this fly, and I'm going to get this fur wet, but I'm not going to get it soaked. So I always keep a little bit of water next to my tying desk, and I don't know if you can see, but I'm just going to put one drop of water on my finger there. All right, and then I'm just going to kind of rub my index finger and thumb together. Just use a little bit of moisture to get some of these fuzzy hairs under control. And you don't want to get it too wet, because eventually, if you wanted to, let's say you had thicker rabbit fur here, if you wanted to make that, if you wanted to spread that rabbit fur down your dubbing loop a little bit further, if you got it really wet, it'd be really hard to spread that. So now that we've got that semi-damp, we're going to grab our dubbing loop, place this into our dubbing loop, and then at this point I'm just keeping tension on the thread, and I'm not grabbing my spinner, I'm just grabbing the thread. And now is the tricky part, where you are going to line up your thread and your fur, orient it where you would like, for the most part, where you'd like to have that loop be. You can make it a little bit longer, or you can pull this thread a little bit further away from that leather for now, so you have room to cut. You can always slide your fur to the left. So I'm going to go ahead and basically going to hold lightly. I'm going to put a little pressure on my loop from behind with my left index finger, and then I'm going to carefully cut this leather off. And this is probably the trickiest part. I'm going to lightly hold it with my left index finger, and I'm going to cut as much of that, or as close to that leather as I can, since I decided I wanted to use most of this leather. And sometimes you'll see what happened here. I've got it all cut off, but it likes to stick to itself, and it'll sometimes pull a little bit out, which that's okay. And now it looks like I've got a mess in that loop, right? It looks like you can't just spin that up, because it's just kind of, it's too far to the right, and you got some hairs all over the place. The first thing I like to do, before worrying about how long or where I'm going to make my butts, right? Instead of worrying about that, I'm just going to spread this down the loop, and I like to start off at the bottom and pull some of the bottom down. The more you spread it up and down this loop, the further you can tie forward in your fly. So if let's say you wanted to tie, let's say this hook was twice this length. If I wanted to get the most out of this fur that I could, and let's say I had enough in there to do this, I would try to spread this as far up and down that loop as I could. And you can also take the point of your scissors, and that can help, pick out some of these little fibers and really separate them nicely. The next part is where, this is where a lot of times the stuff will fall out. And the whole time I'm keeping slight tension on this loop. If I let off tension, my spinner is going to spin, and it's not going to work the way I want, but also some fibers might fall out. Next, I'm going to carefully grab these tips and just slowly pull them, so you see those butts start to get more towards that dubbing loop. And now you notice that I've got much longer fibers. Once I'm happy with the length of those fibers, I'm going to go ahead and pinch my dubbing loop, the thread below that fur. I'm going to grab this spinner, and I'm just going to begin to spin. And then when I feel the tension in between my thumb and my index finger, that's when I'm going to let it off and allow that to spin with some light pressure. All right, you see you get a nice kind of bound up dubbing loop. I'm going to give it one little small spin here. Now, depending on how thick your thread is, if you've got really thin thread like I do, this this is a Uni 6/0. It's pretty fragile, especially once you've got it spun up into a loop. So you want to be careful at this point not to put too much tension on it. And now I'll take my dubbing brush, and I'm going to lightly brush it. So you don't want to put too much pressure when you're brushing. And while I'm brushing this, I'm trying to get down to the core, or the thread. And you'll feel a little bit of tension down on that thread, as far as like you'll feel like you're pulling fur out from right alongside of that thread. Once you don't feel that, like you're pulling thread out, or I'm sorry, that you're pulling fur out from that thread, then you know you've got it pretty well plucked out of there. And you can see I didn't really lose any fur. I've got quite a bit of fur in there. It's looking beautiful now. One point I'll say about this this point right here is that, you know, you could just wrap this in just like it is, but I like to once again use that water. And here you can get a little bit more water on your fingers and basically pull those tips of that fur to one side. So here you see I've got it all kind of pulled to one side. And now I'm ready to wrap forward. So I'm going to begin my wraps. And I'm using this red thread so you can get an idea of, you know, what it looks like with the fur wrapped in. I'm going to do some touching turns here. The whole time, just like any other kind of hackle, I'm going to be pulling back those fibers. And I'm going to continue down the shank. And let's say you had accidentally maybe way too much fur in here as far as how long of a dubbing loop you have. It's just like a feather or any other material that once you get to the point where you're done tying, you can tie it off and cut off. Let's say right there I wanted to finish this fly. I could just tie that off there and cut off the rest of this. But for this fly, I'm just going to keep going forward. Same thing if you accidentally don't have enough material. You know, you could tie this off and retie another dubbing loop, and that'll help you finish off your fly. And we're just about down to the head here. A few more wraps and we should have it. All right, a couple more. And I'm still doing touching turns here. And I'm just about there. All right, now that I'm there, I'm going to do a couple wraps with my dubbing loop. And then I'm going to tie that off. And what I like to do is kind of tie off a few wraps going forward, which helps trap that dubbing loop going forward. And then I'll pull that dubbing loop towards the back of the fly, and then a few wraps going back towards where I want to make that head. That will really lock in that dubbing loop so it doesn't fall out. And now I'll just do a normal whip finish. So I'll grab my whip finishing tool and kind of show you the end result here. And now you see it's just like any other hackle. You've got a couple trap fibers in there. You can take your brush again and brush it out. And you should have an awesome result on your dubbed rabbit fur. Awesome. Thank you so much for watching.